Hello, all. Welcome to the third and final day of our Urban Arc, the fifth edition of our Urban Arc. And today, this panel, our first panel is titled as Fair Work Employment in the City. And we have five papers in this panel. And I'm Neethi. I teach at Indian Institute for Human Settlements in Bangalore. And let me introduce our panelists here. We have Divya, Varma, Maansi, Parpiani, and Kavya, Bharadkar from Aajeevika Bureau Center for Migration and Labor Studies. And we have Anil Kumar Roy and Pragya Sharma from the CEPT University. And we have Priyadarshini, Mohanty, Sona, Alex, Vaseem, Anjum, Sherry from BMS College of Architecture. And the next presentation is from Ashwin, Parulkar, Center for Policy Research, and Anhad, Imaan, Aajeevika Bureau. And we have Jagrati Junjunwala from School of Planning and Architecture, Bhopal. So, very interesting set of papers we have today. And all these papers, something quite interesting. I could see that while two studies are focusing on work and employment and everyday livelihood, life and livelihood in Delhi, one paper is from two cities in Western India, and one paper is from Karnataka, and one paper is from Shillong. So we're really looking forward to all these presentations today. And just a point to note here. So we have 15 minutes for presentations, and then we will collect questions at the end of the session so that everyone will get equal time. And those who want to ask questions, please type in your questions in the chat box or the Q&A box given here, and I'll collate all these questions, and then I'll read them out for the presenters. So we will follow the same sequence as we have given in the program list. So first we will go with the Divya, Varma, Maansi, and Kavya's paper. So here you go. Shall we start, Divya and others?
Yeah, sure. Are you able to see the slides?
Yes, Maansi, we can.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. As some of you know, Aajeevika Bureau is a non-profit that works with migrant workers, that is those who migrate for work. The state's macroeconomic data has suggested for quite a while now that those adopting such migratory livelihoods form a large proportion of India's workforce. In this presentation, we ask why, despite this data and prevalent knowledge, does urban policy exclude these groups from being eligible to access rights to the city and its services? The presentation is divided into two sections primarily. I would start with providing a brief theoretical and conceptual background, and then my colleague Divya would share our research methodology and detailed policy analysis before I sum up with some implications. Our presentation draws from the report Unlocking the Urban that was published last year by Aajeevika Bureau. The report is available online if any of you would like to learn more about it. So just starting with the theoretical and conceptual background, urban policy, as the audience will very well know, has been widely theorized. A persistent line of questioning has been, why do states plan the way they do and why their designs fail, leading to a large number of residents remaining out of planned infrastructure and services. After the turn of this century, particularly, an intensification has been observed in the neoliberal techniques of managing land and labor. Key examples of this phenomenon can be found in the creation of special economic zones, peri-urban expansion projects through flexible acquisition of land, and more recently, utopic grand centralized schemes of greenfield urban development. These developments have pushed theorists to consider the ways in which we perceive the normal versus the deviant. In other words, the imperative is now to focus what we mean by formal when much of urban planning and living is quote unquote informal. There have been calls to theorize from the South, to mainstream the realities that prevail in large majorities of the world and cease comparisons with the ideals of a small minority of the urban experience. This is, of course, not an easy task, and there are many questions that pose themselves. How could a theorization from a space of locally contextualized informality, heterogeneity, and complexity still be made relevant for a global urban studies? In what way would changing and updating the vocabularies that we use help in normalizing a range of intuitive and deliberate practices, which are now all clubbed together as informal or illegitimate or illegal? For instance, how can planned be replaced with equitable or inclusive as an idiom of the cities that we imagine? The urban is now also dominant geographical site and theoretical space for a range of other disciplines, which could be useful to productively engage with to answer some of these questions. We take the instance of the theory of securitization, which, though more prevalent in the disciplines of political science and international relations, has been used to understand contemporary urban governance. Securitization is important to understand the intersections between urban and economic policy, wherein one sees regional states within India now competing with one another for global investment. Lowering labor costs, speeding up land acquisitions have become the ways in which the states frame themselves as rising, vibrant, emerging. There's an effort to secure urban boundaries of the city and narrowly determine eligibility of the legitimate urban resident in accordance with what is considered attractive to global investment and capital. A temporary workforce who would work for low wages and not have rights to settling down in cities or even temporarily benefiting from urban services emerges as ideal in this scenario. In our case studies on the cities of Gujarat, which we would present today, sustained engagement through our local resource centers indicate that these workers are engaged primarily in highly productive sectors like garment production and construction work. But why focus on migrant workers specifically, some of you may want to ask. We suggest that the term is not just a description of the workers, given that many migrated decades ago and are not necessarily still migrant or outsiders. Yet they do remain on the peripheries of the legitimate rights of the city. Thus, the term's function is more relevant as a political and conceptual category to allow for mobilization against these specific exclusions. In this presentation, we use it as a conceptual lens to investigate the trajectories of urban Indian policy. Many of us saw the figure of the migrant worker become very visible during the lockdown last year. Our analysis today, however, aims to consider the long-term and systemic issues faced by this group in cities which all exploded during the lockdown crisis. This focus on migrant worker, we suggest, could have even a broader theoretical relevance for other locations and theorizing from across the world, where growth-intensive strategies have been deployed, for example, in the BRICS countries. Internal migration is widely prevalent in all of these nation states. It is not a coincidence that these tend to be geographies with a history of inequality and violence, which comes to intersect deeply with the labor market when seen through the category of the migrant worker. Lastly, centering such a workforce removes them from the periphery of urban imagination and mainstreams its heterogeneous and multi-local ways of living and working. Over to Divya now to talk more about some of our research findings, objectives, and methodology.
Maansi, could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you for that. So just to sort of briefly describe the objectives of the study,
It was mainly undertaken with the aim to locate the experiences of migrant workers within the social policies that are widely applicable in the urban domain, and to examine the extent to which their needs have really been recognized by the imagination of our urban policies and provided for in those. And also a simultaneous objective was to analyze the experiences in implementation of these policies with respect to the presence of circular migrants, seasonal migrants who are very mobile in nature, who move from one city to another, and within a same city, they move from one work site to another. So to analyze the presence of the circular migrants in the city and how these policies, whether or not they actually do provide for the multi-dimensional livelihood strategies adopted by migrant workers and their logics of survival. Again, as Maansi described, our evidence is primarily focused on the cities of Ahmedabad and Surat in Gujarat, which is where Aajeevika Bureau has been working with this community for over 15 years now. And the methodology has primarily been a comprehensive review of urban policies at the central, state, and municipal level in these cities, as well as interviews with actual government functionaries in Ahmedabad and Surat, the municipal corporations, the urban development authorities, the city level health and ICDS departments, with the deputy mayor and the corporators, and all of these key sort of functionaries. Additionally, we've also looked at, apart from, of course, the policies in the urban domain like Amrut and NULM and PMAY, and Gujarat state's own policies for affordable housing. We've also looked at important policies in other domains, such as National Health Mission, Swachh Bharat Mission, National Food Security Act, and their implementation vis-a-vis the needs of migrant workers. Lastly, we've also examined the labor policies, such as Factory Act, Shops and Establishments Act, and the Interstate Migrant Workmen Act, because these have specific relevance to migrant workers, as most of the units that employ these workers are registered under these acts. So we wanted to examine what are their provisions, whether or not they have any provisions with respect to dignified accommodation and access to basic urban public provisioning for migrant workers in cities. Yeah. Could we move to the next slide? So once we come to the analysis of these policies, I think one of the fundamental issues is how eligibility is determined. If we look at the entire politics around enumeration, we find that census data really forms the basis for many supply side decisions in these urban policies, including budgeting and staffing for the implementation of national programs. And we all recognize that census is a stock exercise, which is undertaken once in 10 years. And specifically with respect to migrant workers, it is also riddled with various definitional issues, because it does not define seasonal or circular migration in an appropriate manner, because of which migration flows are really not captured adequately at all in the census, especially of those migrants who lead multi-local lives and are mobile between the village and the city and across various cities. And migrants in the cities predominantly live in inside their work sites, for example, in construction sites or inside the factories, inside hotels, or in open space dwellings in large plots of public land or on pavements. And none of these predominant migrant housing typologies are really enumerated under the census. And because these are not enumerated, even in city-based enumeration exercises, that really affects the deployment of public infrastructure, such as water and sewerage lines to these migrant settlements through national policies like Amrut. More recently, of course, policies like NULM and the Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, they draw from the socio-economic caste census. So that's a departure from the decennial census. And SCCC very notably has attempted to cover the informal workforce and their dwellings. But we all know that the data quality and reliability of SCCC has been really under the scanner. The second sort of very fundamental flaw with respect to determining eligibility for migrant workers in urban policy entitlements is the sedentary bias of these policies. So every time a worker is called upon to prove his or her own residence in the city through producing local documents establishing their domicile in the city, and that really kind of hinders or constrains their access to a wide variety of public provisioning and entitlements. One very kind of striking example is how the incentives for ANMs and ASHA workers are determined. So ANMs and ASHA workers are really incentivized for continuously vaccinating the same individual, a same pregnant mother or a child, but that's really misaligned with the mobility of migrants who keep moving from one settlement to another, or lead very transient lives in the cities. Similarly, nutritious food supplements and cash transfers under a range of schemes for children, pregnant mothers, adolescent girls, these are only available to people with domicile documents, thus cutting them off from very critical services like public health and early child care. Again, reservation under PMAY, for example, cannot be transferred really from one state to another. SC and ST communities, which form a large majority of migrant workforce, if they don't feature on the state list of another state, destination state that they're migrating to, they're not eligible for these entitlements or reservations under them. Skill trainings, for example, they're not eligible unless they're able to produce a domicile certificate. Similarly, tertiary healthcare is another example where access is cut off because they are not legitimate residents of the city. A last example on this point is water tankers that the city makes available. The city governments do have the infrastructure of water tankers available, but these are primarily imagined as solutions to address temporary water shortage for people with existing water connections. While they could easily solve the access to water issue for a large number of migrants who live inside work sites or in open spaces. However, these are only used to address people with existing water connections and existing kind of documents. Yeah, we can move to the next one. If we look at the whole politics of informality that is differentiated through complex sort of political processes, in the case of in situ slum redevelopment, as I said, because migrant settlements are not enumerated, they are not recognized, they are not considered as legitimate kind of settlements in the city. So they just remain underserviced by any sort of housing or infrastructure policies. They are constantly called upon to produce proofs of residence of having lived in a location for more than a certain number of years, depending upon the cutoff dates. And that really becomes exclusionary because of two reasons. One is because migrants don't have ownership of any of these properties. They're most often tenants in these areas. And especially for newer migrants who do not have any domicile documents to prove, they're just struggling to gain a foothold in the city. Another sort of striking finding was that the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana policy document actively discriminates against migrant workers. I've produced a quotation here. It's a direct quote from the policy document, which says that, which really calls upon the government to consider possible temporary migration from rural areas to the city just to take advantage of the housing schemes and exclude such migrants from the list of beneficiaries. And we all know that given the magnitude in which rural distress is happening and how that is such a big trigger for urban migration, this kind of a suggestion that migrants would move to the city just in order to be able to take advantage of a housing scheme is really
Sorry to interrupt you, Divya.
Yeah.
2 minutes are over. Could you conclude your presentations now?
Okay, sure. Yeah, can we move to the next slide, Maansi? So there is a big dichotomy between urban and labor governance. For example, the urban governance mechanisms do not really take into account, the presence of migrants in industrial clusters, which again do not get serviced by municipal corporations. Similarly, from the point of view of labor governance, the labor policies like Factories Act, Interstate Migrant Workers Act, or the Shops and Establishments Act do not make any provisions for providing access to migrants to dignified housing or basic amenities. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. ULBs do not have very limited autonomy, because of which they are not able to account for any sort of changes in their seasonal kind of labor migration that they see in the cities today. Similarly, the city plans are decennial in nature and they do not take into account migration inflows to the city. Yeah, next point, please. So they basically fall through the cracks also because they do not have any voting rights in the city, and they are not able to exercise any political leverage or get response from councillors in terms of enabling their access to urban entitlements. They experience eviction to a great extent, and also ethnic, class and caste-based stigmatization. Yeah. Maansi, do you want to sum up?
Yeah, just quickly to say that what our analysis has tried to do is, look at how state practices have furthered an othering of the migrant by removing them from the eligibility of basic services. And even though we want to acknowledge that, there have been new policies that have been announced after the lockdown, particularly the new rental housing policy, there have already been words of caution issued by scholars to not have them kind of replace existing policies, and to consider why existing policies have not been inclusive in the first place. The implications for our study, we suggest, is that they complicate a certain reform argument that newer policies are made because they have to improve on the previous ones. And by providing a template of what should be the bare minimum in an urban policy for it to be inclusive of migrant workers, we hope that there'll be more future research on this matter.
Thanks, Maansi and Divya. We now move to Anil Kumar Roy and Pragya Sharma. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Neethi. Yes, and an excellent beginning of this session with this reality of migrant workers, so relevant in this COVID. So let me set the background of our paper together, and Pragya will take over from me in 2 minutes. Pragya, are you ready, please? So we kind of located this particular role of housing, land rights into housing, particularly in Delhi, which houses many slums and huge number of slums in poverty in the metropolitan India's largest or second largest metropolitan cities. And therefore we thought, let us understand the recent development in granting the property rights and land rights by the state legislature, and therefore how it helps in improving the conditions, both living conditions as well as housing conditions. So that's the two dimension of this particular paper, two aspects of this paper that we are going to deal with in these 15 minutes. So I think this is an in-house research program of CEPT University, and then we work on our core competency from the students' background. So I would not take much time. I request Pragya to take over and finish in 15 minutes or maybe less than that. Thank you so much. Over to you, Pragya.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, go ahead, Pragya.
Okay. So, presently 1 billion people are residing in slums. It is estimated that 3 billion people will require adequate housing and affordable housing by 2030. As per census in India, 68 million people are in slums. 17.4% of total urban population is residing in slums. So, the initial response to these slums was forced evictions and resettlement in public housing. Then in 1970s, John Turner brought a different approach in view that slums were more of a solution to the housing demand of urban poor. He proposed that recognizing incremental housing and legalization of spontaneous urban growth would improve their living conditions. Delhi recently passed two initiatives along the similar principles in 2019: Policy for In situ rehabilitation for squatter settlements and Bill for recognition of property rights of residents in unauthorized colonies. So, based on this, we arrived with the aim of the research to examine the role of land rights in improving the housing and living conditions of urban poor in Delhi NCT. Based on this, we arrived with two objectives. First of which is to understand the legal and institutional framework that have guided the development of slums in Delhi, for which we did content analysis of bills and acts passed in the past by the government organizations. And the second objective was to assess the impact of land rights on living and housing conditions, of which for which we conducted a sample survey. So a detailed methodology for the sample survey was that we selected three sites within a radii of 5 kilometers, which has been like in that place fully occupied at least since 2000. So the criteria for selection of site was uh, that they had to had a variation in their land ownership. So our target group was JJ clusters, which had no land rights, and followed by unauthorized colonies, which have semi-formal rights, and resettlement colonies, which have formal rights. For the survey, 50 households from each site, making a sample size of 150 households, was covered. The survey conducted was conducted as a random sample survey so that we could spatially cover the whole area uniformly. The pink dots on the map, if you can see, are the location of the households that we surveyed. So the questionnaires included household profile, household condition, living conditions, and income expenditure. Hello, is the slides visible? Am I audible?
Yeah, Pragya, go ahead. Speed up, please. Yeah, go
Okay,
to the
okay.
findings.
So out of the six, we have six some categories in Delhi, out of which three have uh, recognized ownership, whereas other three have variation of this. So the legal framework was that uh, first TDA Act was came into being where JJ clusters were evicted and were resettled. Then MPD 2007 to 2021 instigated that we should regularize this, like it initiated it all. Then DUSIP came into act under GNCTD and was the nodal agency for resettlement and rehabilitation. Under the order of 2013, resettlement 45 resettlement colonies, their right to freehold was recognized. And after coming of 2015 of Delhi slum and Jhuggi Jhopri rehabilitation and relocation policy, it was proposed that after resettlement, the tenements will be given a leasehold, which will automatically convert it to freehold after 10 years. Then the PMAY scheme also propagated that in-situ rehabilitation should be favored more. And the bill that was passed in Lok Sabha authorized the 1797 unauthorized colonies. The property rights were recognized. And locality, we have four major institutions that deal with housing for these slum settlements. Based on this analysis, we came to a conclusion that there was a lack of clarity in nomenclature as there was an overlap between the settlements of unauthorized colonies, urban villages, and JJ clusters. Then there was no provision provided for the evictees which were ineligible for resettlement. Thirdly, the DUSIP, that was the nodal agency for resettlement and rehabilitation, could not initiate any process until it gets permission from the landowning agency. So in most of the cases, the landowning agency is DDA with 56. So unless and until they give the permission, DUSIP cannot initiate any survey or anything for their upliftment. Then the residents were not really recognized as active stakeholders. The wanted to be relocated or resettled in situ. Then we come to the sample survey, which covers the objective 2 of our study, which was to assess the impact of land rights. So first we'll cover living conditions, then housing conditions, and income expenditure. So looking at the images, we can tell how the residents have invested in their households. Chuna Bhatti is the JJ cluster which had no land rights. Here the houses were semi-pakka with residential roads not wider than 2 meters. Whereas both Nangli Jalib and Madipur had some extent of legality to their rights. So they have invested and have access like pakka housing. Then we have water and sanitation. Both the sites, Madipur and Nangli Jalib, had individual connections to both of these things, whereas Chuna Bhatti had community connections. Then we come to solid waste collection. Door-to-door collection service was available in Nangli Jalib and to some extent in Madipur, while it was completely missing in Chunabatti. These three parameters reflected that the quality of services provided by the government across the sites depended on the formality of the ownership they had. Then we come to the housing conditions. So Madipur has a secure land tenure, and that is reflected in the higher household size, while it is less in Chunabhatti, where the land rights are totally missing. As the land titles are clear, the investment is more. Hence, residents in Madipur have higher ownership and have access to higher carpet area as compared to Chunabhatti. Then when we consider education level is also higher in the sites with full or partial land rights. As these people have now started to invest in human capital, this is simultaneously reflected in average household income and types they are involved in. Then we come to the household industry. So both Madipur and Chuna Bhatti, they were there is a high presence of skilled labor within these settlements. So obviously household industries cropped up. So Chunabhatti has household industry of wooden wooden furniture due to the presence of Lakkad Mandi and interior design showrooms in proximity in Kirtinagar. Whereas Madhipur also had a presence of skilled labor, so and it was catered to footwear household industry. So and these are very small areas in which these industries are operating. Like each plot is like 25 to 40 square meter in Chunabhatti, whereas it is 20 to 25 square meter in Madhipur. Uh, so when we come to monthly expenditure, Chunabhatti has only rent and food as their major spending for themselves, whereas a majority of their expenditure is them sending back money home to their villages. And if we observe Chunabhattiga, we do not see any expenditure for electricity, education, or health. These are due to the initiative of the recent Army Party initiatives, where they provided free electricity and education and the mohalla clinics. So that is also reflected in this graph. Then we come to asset ownership. So as these people uh, have secured housing, they have started to acquire more commodities. So if we look at Chunabhatti, the residents have prioritized television and mobile more because they have free electricity now. It is now considered a basic good. Then in Madhipur, they have acquired more goods which are basic in nature, such as separate kitchen, cooler, jewelry. Then we come to Nangli Jalib. So as the household income is more, the investment has also changed. Here people have moved on to the luxurious goods such as ACs and computers and four-wheeler vehicles. So in conclusion, we can say that land rights do have a positive impact on the living conditions and housing conditions. The improvement in accessing amenities and provision by the government has also improved with the better formality of land. And these rights have also enabled the investment by the households in housing and the human capital, such as education and the housing they access. So finally, we can say that these do have land rights do have an impact, and we need to incorporate these within our policies.
Yes,
Thank you.
Pragya. Sorry for the video. Your videos were not been clear a bit, but yes, message is all clear. And I have nothing to say in the conclusion that yes, the land and property rights do matters, but how it gets executed and how it improves the living conditions, and then come out from this vicious cycle of slums and poverty. But it's long way to go. We'd not right now on the basis of this case study tell that yes, it has brought everything to the slum dwellers. So thank you very much for listening to our presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Anil, Kumar, Roy, and Pragya. Let's now move on to our third presentation. Over to you, Priyadarshini, Sona, and Vaseem Anjum. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Neethi. Good morning to the fellow panelists and attendees. Today we will be presenting our paper, Morphology of Narasimharajapura, post-COVID-19, People Perceptions, Spatial Manifestations and Representations. I will start by first discussing the structure of the presentation. We will briefly look at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on various scenarios, from the international global scenario we will discuss right up to the local scenario, where we will specifically discuss the case of Narasimharajapura, which is also known as NR-Pura. We will look at how the people, economic activities, spatial manifestations and representations of NR-Pura have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns. We will finally conclude by making a comprehensive study of our observations. Looking at the various scenarios, COVID-19 pandemic shocked the world in the early January of 2020. Initially, the global community took it in different approaches, but very soon there were nationwide lockdowns. With the global borders being sealed, trade restricted, and confinement measures in place, there was a major hit to the health and economy. The healthcare system was overwhelmed with the number of COVID cases and the dramatic number of life losses. There was a drop in economy, a drastic drop in fact. Certain sectors of the economy, it was feasible to work from home using internet connectivity. For other sectors that could not adapt, especially the informal sector, it took a major hit back. Looking at the national impact, in our case, in the Indian scenario, India was under lockdown from the 25th of March 2020 to the 31st of May 2020. Millions were in lockdown. Different parts of the society was impacted differently. Migrant laborers, as we've been discussing, were majorly hit as they lost their daily wages. They had no money for their food or shelter and were desperate to return to their hometown. Farmers were distressed as their cycle of cultivating crops and selling them was disrupted. There was another part of the society that continued working from home using ICT connectivity. Education went online and children could continue their education. We will now look at the state impact, and we look at the specific case of Karnataka. There were lockdowns across the state, just as in the rest of the country. Transportation restrictions resulted in the economy bleeding. Migrants in terms of laborers, professionals, and students. Some of them wished to leave the cities, and go back to their hometown, whether in the same state in Karnataka itself or other states. As we know, Karnataka has a very strong IT sector. A large part of the IT sector did also stay back and continue working from home. At the district level impact, we saw that people who were able to avail permits or passes returned to their hometown and enjoyed family time while working from home. In these different scenarios, we have seen that it was feasible to work from home. Work from home is a concept in the 1970s, but the pandemic scenario, the lockdowns in the pandemic scenario, made different other sectors of the economy adapt quickly, and they found it quite beneficial to be operating in this fashion. This resulted in a lot of reflex inflow of people from cities to the towns. Here, what we are questioning is, if this is going to be lifestyle, how has this life change in scenario of work from home and reverse influx to smaller towns impacted these smaller towns in the context of India or small Indian towns? We will look at the specific case of Narasimharajapura. To familiarize you with the town of Narasimharajapura, we will look at its location, physical settings, morphology, physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, people economics, and spatial representations. Narasimharajapura is a small town situated in the Narasimharajapura Taluka in Chikmagalur district, Karnataka, India. It is set at the foothills of the Western Ghats at 697 meters above sea level. It is fringed by the Bhadra Reservoir. It has fertile soil and pleasant climate, making it a very habitable place. Narasimharajapura Taluka has a population of about 66,000 with a high literacy rate, and most people engaged in agriculture and agriculture-related activities. It has 58 villages and one town. Narasimharajapura town is this one town in Narasimharajapura Taluk. Narasimharajapura town has a population of 7,500, a high literacy rate at the rest of the taluk, and people are engaged in agricultural activities.
Now we come to the morphology of Narasimharajapura, or we call it as Ennarpura. Ennarpura was earlier called as Edihalli. It came under the Lakolli Taluk until 1882. But as the king Narasimharaja Wadayar visited Edihalli in 1915, it was renamed as Ennarpura or Narasimharajapura. It was one of the highest paddy growers in the state. The nearest towns that is closest to the Ennarpura town is Shimoga, Tarikere, Koppa, and Sringeri. The road from Shimoga is via the Bakrahalla bridge that you see here, and that came into the town's main road. The other road which went from Ennarpura to Tarikere via road and via rail was through the Tadsa bridge. So this Tadsa bridge was a joining point for the rail which came from Hebbe as well as the train which came from Tarikere. The road from Ennarpura to Koppa, Mangalore was via the southwest road, and the only spline that was the part of the city or the town was the TB road, which was the Travelers Bungalow road, which has a Travelers Bungalow at the end of the TB road. The central part of the town has shops flanked on each sides by Kirana shops. Then came the development of this whole district. A dam was proposed in Lakwadli, the Bhadra Dam on the Bhadra River. 42,000 acres of land, including forest area, were submerged when the Bhadra Dam was constructed in 1965. As the fertile land of the paddy fields drowned in water, villages from 20 villages lost their livelihood along with the generation of the rich old culture and tradition. With the submergence of the land, the transportation and communication system too were lost. So did some of the old bridges like the Bakrihalla Bridge and the Tadsa Bridge. These bridges were submerged under water for almost 60 years. It only resurfaced during a summer when the water level went very low. Both the bridges are still intact as they were built by lime, brick, and sand. The tramway was commissioned from Tarikere to Narasimharajapura on May 15, 1915, but was suspended in 1949 due to the construction of the Bhadra Dam. Due to the submergence of these roads and bridges, the result was Shimoga, which was earlier 38 kilometers from Ennarpura, is now 66 kilometers. Tarikere, which was 42 kilometers from Ennarpura, is now 68 kilometers. Chikmagalur, which was 55 kilometers, is now 96 kilometers. The fertile land and the rich heritage of the Malnad region was destroyed with the construction of the dam that in turn helped in solving drinking water crisis. Hence, a new road was built from Shimoga to Ennarpura via the Mensud Bridge. A jail was built a decade and a half back on the TB road beyond the town limits. A decade back, the bypass was made for travelers traveling towards Koppa, Sringeri, and Mangalore. Due to the increase in the water level of the backwaters during rainy seasons, the whole area around Ennarpura gets flooded. Now we go to the physical infrastructure of this little town. Enarpura town is a small little town with a total distance of 2 square kilometers. With a change in the geographical pattern of this town, presently the main physical connectors into this town are Shimoga, Enarpura, and Enarpura, Koppa, Sringeri, Mangalore, and Chikmagalur roads. The buses come and go from these places into this town, which is in the node. There is a bus stand in the node of the town. The Halepete or the old market, which got the whole old market road, got expanded as there was more traffic on this road, and it became a 12-meter road. But the TB road, which has shops on either sides, is only 9 meters and has no scope for expansion. The TB road, which goes to the State Highway 65, got expanded and was made as 18 meters highway. The water in this place is sourced from the Badra Reservoir and also from the borewells and underground wells. Sewage, some independent houses have their own septic tanks and other drain into the municipal drainage. Electricity is sourced from the main power grid. Very few people tap the solar energy and use it for heating, and few electrical light points. Communication, ICT services are available. Initially, it was only BSNL, but over a time, other agencies like Airtel Geo and other services were made available. In terms of social infrastructure, Enarpura town has the basic amenities that a town of this size and population usually consists of. In terms of law and order, the police station is right in the node of the town, and, and there is a little jail for petty crimes. In terms of healthcare, there is a government medical hospital and a private medical hospital and a number of private clinics. In terms of administrative buildings, the town has a mini Vidhana Saudha, the Taluk Panchayat office, the town Panchayat office, and Gram Panchayat office. There is a heritage school which is of 115 years old, and there are a number of private and government schools in this town. There is only one PU college on the way to Shivamogga. There are a number of religious structures like temples, churches, and mosques, but a notable one is Sri Atishaya Kshetra Simhagadde Jwala Malni Digambara Jain Temple, which is 1000 years old and houses Bhagwan Sri 1008 Shantinatha Tirthankara deity. Now we come to the situation of people in Enarpura. Enarpura town shows the population diversity with respect to various linguistic groups, Kannadigas and Malayalis being the dominant, and religious affiliations, a substantial Hindus, Jains, Christians, and Muslim population. With respect to economic communities, communities are engaged in agriculture, trade, and fishing. Agriculture with respect to climate and terrain. Trade with respect to mostly agro-based industries, and fishing from the backwaters. There is also a fishing community who live here. The population also shows the traditional societal stratification with the landlords owning lands and labor class engage in different economic activities. With people who migrated from Enarpura, people from this little town migrated to bigger cities for education, job opportunities, and simply better lifestyles. As the job opportunities for educated class was almost negligible here. But the important thing to be noted here is that at the later stages of their lives, these migrants came back to the origin for a peaceful and a retired life. The people who came back would be the people who had fixed assets, and that would be their driving force to return. In terms of economics, Enarpura was perceived to have a dominant agricultural economy and trade in the agricultural products. Basic economic activity was trading of agricultural produce, rubber, aracanut, pepper, cashew, coffee, which were the main primary cash crops due to the terrain and climate of this particular place. The local traders catered to the needs of the local population in the non-basic economy. Land values were perceived to have been stable as there was no much of demand for buying and selling property. In terms of spatial manifestations, the town has 3 primary arterial roads, which is where the little change and growth happened over time. The architecture is vernacular and traditional. The built form is traditional in character with a pitched roof forms due to climatic conditions. Public infrastructure was concentrated in the town center. The buildings were low to mid-rise with a maximum of only 3 floors. Residential units belonged to the landlord class and were single unit houses. The physical and social infrastructure of the town had not evolved much in the recent past. Traditional built forms had been adapted to house modern facilities. The town had basic supply of electricity and ICT. Now we see how Narasimharajapura reacted during the lockdown period. In terms of people, most migrants had migrated from Enarpura for better education, jobs, and better opportunities, managed to get back before the total lockdown. As the whole world worked from home, so did the people who got back. They used the internet facility which was available. Like any other city or town, people from IT and other professionals stayed indoors and worked from home. But the farmers, estate owners were in a difficult situation as their crops, cultivation, or produce had to be either harvested or sold as per the time schedule. The traders were under loss as there was no trade or business. These primary and tertiary sector people were unhappy with the lockdown situation. Enarpura did not have any major case of COVID-19 as people had stopped moving in and out, and it was considerably a safer place for the city dwellers who had already moved in. The district administrative officers were quite strict. As the first lockdown opened up, the essential services were allowed to be operated. Hence, agriculture, which was among one of the essential list, were allowed. Farmers and workers started their regular work. As in the case of India, the migrant workers started returning to their hometowns. Thus, the migrant workers who had migrated from Enarpura also started returning. Skilled and unskilled workers started returning to their place of origin. The IT and the other professionals who had the option of work from home stayed back in Enarpura. Students and professionals who had the option to continue to work from home stayed back in this little town. In terms of economics, huge losses were incurred by the people in the primary, secondary, and the tertiary sector economy. Farmers could not sell their produce to the outside market, so the produce was sold at nominal prices in the local market. But the positive aspect was that the locals started getting better produce in the local market, which were earlier exported. Agro-based industries remained closed and incurred losses. Trade was almost negligible, hence the prices dropped and people incurred huge loss. As was the case around the world, Enarpura also looked deserted and faced economic depression. In terms of spatial manifestation, the town looked deserted. Movement in the town was limited to only essential services. As the little town opened, agricultural activities also resumed. The essential services were allowed to operate. Hence, agriculture farmers were one of the first to venture out. As it was across India, migrant workers from Enarpura too returned to their hometown, and as they were suddenly jobless in the cities. And so, hence, there was good number of skilled and unskilled workers available in Enarpura. Now we go to the situation after the lockdown.
The native migrants who had returned to Enarpura continued to stay in Enarpura.
Sorry to interrupt you, Priyadarshini and Sona. It's all 15 minutes already. So please take another 1 minute and conclude your presentation. Thanks.
Sure, Neethi. Sure. So the migrant natives who had returned to Enarpura, they continued to stay back as they were enjoying the lifestyle of being in the environment and being with their family. But there was a lifestyle that they were used to in the cities, so they had certain demands of products that they wanted. The town and its market stepped up to these demands and brought in these specialized goods like packaged food and branded goods. These people were also used to buying products online from various online platforms. Delivery persons were seen bringing in bringing in goods to the town from Kopa. So there was a floating corporation from Kopa that came into Enarpura, increasing the traffic in Enarpura. The local markets also started home deliveries. The economic perception at this stage was the tertiary sector had expanded to include the IT sector economy. New businesses like soap manufacturing, online sale of garments that ladies started during the lockdown continued. Labour started learning new trade and skills. Migrant workers easily found job on the estates as the estates had a demand for workers. Small eateries started to appear in the town. There was a surge in vehicular traffic as the people who had returned to Enarpura, the working class, came back in their cars. There were a large number of cars. Now the 9-meter wide road of Enarpura seemed to be much narrower as the edges were occupied by cars. There was an increase in number of service centers and car exchange and second-hand showrooms started to appear. The spatial manifestations in terms of houses, the families had become larger now. So there was an expansion of the existing houses, so construction activity there was noticed. Estate owners' children started taking interest in the agricultural farming, so there was perceived increase in land value. New townships started appearing as there was a demand for properties, and again we see there was an interest in living in Narasimharajapura. There was new internet connectivity, parking that we see, and groceries and kirana shops had now become supermarkets. This was the spatial manifestation. We can conclude by saying COVID-19 pandemic lockdown has been a catalyst in the morphology of Narasimharajapura. There has been changes, both physical and non-physical. People who came back had started enjoying better quality of life, where they could take care of their estates and farms and do their daily jobs. Their needs were being met by the locals, as we discussed earlier. This introduced new economic activities and trade into the traditional Indian settlement. The town atmosphere is now marked by changes, both perceptive and cognitive. These changes, we believe, are irreversible changes in the spatial manifestation, representations, as well as the transformed places, and will trigger further more changes. Thank you, Neethi. Sorry for the extra time.
Thanks for this that very positive story from Ennapura. So now let's move on to our fourth presentation. So over to you, Ashwin and Anhad.
Thank you. I'll just share the screen really quick. Is the screen visible?
Yes, this is visible.
Okay, I'll just maximize the slides here. And we're good? Is this okay?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for having accepted our paper, and it was a pleasure to listen to all the previous presentations. So I'll just we'll just get right into it. Our paper, which is called "All Is Not Well on the Yamuna Front," is essentially about the working conditions of the homeless migrant, predominantly male laborers who live in this area. And so what is this area? There's a large, extensive, or an extensive literature on Yamuna Pushta, which is essentially a geography of a poor area in central Delhi that over the years has suffered an extensive waves of demolitions, which happened predominantly in the last decade. And today it is home to about 6,000 people who live on the streets and or shelters. So this picture here shows you a couple men who are on one of the main stretches of a 1.8 kilometer path that goes from Nigamund Ghat to Kashmir Gate. And this is the Pushta. And essentially the people who inhabit this place are, and this is what we'll get into throughout the course of the discussion, are laborers who work in numerous daily wage jobs, not only in the city, but outside of the city. But most important to note is that they access these jobs here. So to frame this discussion, we want to raise the question of what kind of urban space Yamuna Pushta is, how it has been discussed and theorized and analyzed in the literature. We have a situation where thousands of male migrants are intricately active in the economy and in the ways of the city. However, according to the ways in which settlements are recognized, and there have been discussions in this panel itself of the certain exclusions of getting entitlements if one is not a resident of a particular place. This, of course, affects the people who live here. And it's because of some of these modalities that it's been envisioned as a non-place by Bharadkar, who essentially reminds us that unlike an anthropological space, the Pushta is a place that is not acknowledged as one that has shared social relations, and it is one that is not recognized as having communities as such. What we want to put out there is that it may possibly be this acknowledged or lack of acknowledgement or this invisibility that renders the people who live there exploited to a certain degree by the dynamics of the informal economy. And in this way, the place is not necessarily invisible, while it is to policymakers, while it is to perhaps the rest of the city. It is a dynamic place which is utilized very effectively by the people who live there, and to some degree, it is a social geography, which has been a term given to certain urban spaces of poverty by Barbara Harris White, of those people, particularly homeless people, who, excluded by the system, still manage to access basic resources that they need for their survival. And before I move on, I'll just quote one of the people that we interviewed, who describes the area as such. And he's describing the need for safety. A head loader who, I'm quoting him here, a head loader who slept behind company bog, and that is a labor choke, said, "Bhai, sleep here." He asked me where I was from, so I told him. He said, "Sleep here," indicating the spot next to him. Not there. People get mugged there. I slept alongside him without hassle for 15 days. And then he goes on to describe the fact that that was a prerequisite for finding work in the city. So the paper then that we have on hand seeks to understand if this is a place which is highly active economically through the lives or through the activities of the people who live there. What exactly are the conditions that the unsheltered daily wage men work under? Then, flowing from that, what skills do they actually possess? And what are the barriers they actually face to decent working conditions? And that question is those questions are framed with the knowledge that highly mobile, destitute migrants, again, are invisible to policymakers, but they are highly prized by informal economy power brokers. And what I mean by that, what I'll show in just a few seconds, is that there are contractors, of course, who hire migrants for various daily wage jobs in the city. And these places like Yamuna and Pushta are nodal points for such activity. Before we get to those three questions, I just want to show how the government has responded to this problem, and how the place is used via shelters. Currently, the shelters in Delhi are not used, but not under the NULM guidelines, National Urban Livelihood Mission guidelines, meaning the city does not avail those funds, but through court orders, all cities in the country are required to abide by them. The problem is that, and a similar point was made earlier, that the policy is heavily biased towards a supply side framing, and less so on providing the livelihood enhancing programs to the homeless that are supposedly available to other communities. And one of these guidelines that I want to focus on here, or just highlight, is the spatial guideline of 50 square feet per person is how much space a shelter should have per person, per resident. So the shelters in Delhi show us how space, not only the space in a shelter is used, but it essentially shows us how a geography is used. So what we have on the left is we have all of Delhi shelters, which number between 198 and 223, given there are fluctuations during the winter. There are temporary shelters that are put up during the winter. And on the right, we have the Pushta shelters, about 18 to 21. Now, what I want to draw your attention to here is that the actual space provided in shelters is absolutely abysmally low. only 18 square feet per person is allotted officially to residents, and that's overall in the city. And in Pushta, only 16 square feet officially, and that's the these are the yellow lines here, right? The occupancy rates of these places are also officially quite low. In the city overall, 38%. Pushta overall, 44%. However, because the space is so limited, we see that the overall square foot per person that's actually used is barely reaching the recommended guideline of 50 square feet, and if that at all, which means that the system overall in Delhi is at full capacity, and in the Pushta is at over capacity, since there's only 38 square feet per person. Now, why do people use these spaces? They don't use them just because they're there. Of course, that's part of it, because if you are homeless, then you need a place to stay. But of course, it's arguable that staying in a place that's highly congested is preferable sometimes to even sleeping out on the street. But they're there because they are located near the chowks. And what we see is that in a system that is congested and overcrowded, that even the slight decreases that occur, that I should say that the decreases that occur in occupancy rates from 2017 to the present is only in highly congested spaces, which to a certain degree means that what we can, at least at this point, hypothesize before getting into the actual findings, is that there is a draw in this area that pulls people to live there despite the dangers that persist. And one of those dangers being the overcrowded shelters, which are public health hazards, which are not sufficiently provided for in terms of space and other amenities. So now we'll move along there with that as the framing and the context, and Anhad will explain the findings.
Thanks, Ashwin. Am I audible to everybody? Am I audible to everyone?
I can.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. What I'm going to do is provide a very rapid distillation of a pile of findings about that high. So good luck me. Thanks to the IHS again for this opportunity. Here we have an employment distribution of all our respondents. And as you can see that most of them are absorbed in what we've called Shadi party work. That's common parlance for wedding reception, work available at wedding receptions. It's also the single largest source of livelihood for the men in the area. This work is seasonally available. Laborers are in high demand from October to April, but the active hiring periods are from October and January and March to mid-April, also consistent with what we know to be the wedding season in Delhi. Typically, men go to neighboring cities in Punjab and Haryana, such as Ludhiana and Chandigarh, but also as far as Mumbai. I'd like to point out that this distribution across these various categories, such as tent house construction, daily wages outside the Shadi party work, and rickshaw pulling, these do not imply distinction in skills from those employed in Shadi party work itself. But the others category here, the gardeners, cooks, rack pickers, drivers, tourists, guides, etc., these represent those homeless laborers who acquired skills by work outside the Shadi party work. Next slide, Ashwin. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to quickly run through some of our language and math skills that we've assessed for this population. The language skills were assessed on the respondents' capabilities to read, write, speak, and understand each Hindi and English. And based on these capabilities across the 4 attributes, we were fetched with the categories literate, semi-literate, and illiterate. English literacy, as you can see, is extremely low, whereas Hindi literacy is slightly above the 2009-10 NSS estimate. We also assessed math skills because counting and basic arithmetic were deemed important and crucial to exploitation in labor markets. Because these workers work long, unregulated hours, and their inability to ascertain wages per hour is a very, very acute vulnerability. It's also interesting to see that educational qualification over here and literacy may not mean the same thing. About a third of the respondents never went to school, but of the remaining 69, at least half has at least secondary education. Even then, most are not able to find work based on their education qualification. This means that over 50% should otherwise be able to find at least better paying work, but they can't. Next slide. Now, based on a set of skills that we sort of came up with on our conversations with the workers themselves, we have a list here of employable skills. Our findings reveals that 93% of our respondents have at least one of these employable skills, whereas 21% have two. And yet 83% have reported never having found work based on these employable skills, which opens up a wide variety of questions. Next slide. Now, of course, Ashwin has sort of elucidated this in some ways in the beginning, but here are some of the barriers to work. About nearly half of them attributed their inability to find good, better paying work due to lack of identification. Yes, I'm just quickly, but the main lesson from these findings is that these exclusions are multifaceted, not just in the social protection systems of the government, but discrimination and behavioral and disciplinary problems associated with the Pushta itself. Pushta is usually recognized as a place of people with drug and alcohol addiction problems, not just in not just in the area there, but also in popular discourse. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. Nearly 50% of the respondents do not qualify for vocational training programs because of the minimum 8 standard educational requirement. If this is reminiscent of our findings, if they're reminiscent of national trends, then nothing could be more unfortunate. 60% do not have the required documentation. It's also important to remember that many of these people are highly stigmatized, traumatized, vulnerable not just to the vagaries of nature, but also police brutality, tuberculosis, and road accidents, and therefore lack severe self-esteem and confidence to seek higher paying work. Lastly, what is most peculiar is that the 33 men who actually are eligible or meet the eligibility criteria for vocational training programs, 14 have said that they were unwilling to receive any training for skills, which of course again opens up a wide variety of questions up for discussion in this session. Next slide, please. This will, of course, be elucidated towards the end by Ashwin, but I'd like to just say that the men at the Pushta survive through daily wage work, but suffer because of lack of decent and adequate shelters, lack of decent wages and working conditions, and most importantly, lack of acknowledgement and policy status, wired again to the need for extending the NULM. Now, I'd like to request Ashwin to quickly go through, just a few seconds for Ashwin to quickly go through the recommendations that we've come up with in this paper. Over to you, Ashwin.
Sorry to interrupt you, Ashwin and Anhad. We are running out of time. Could you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, this is the last.
Perhaps
yeah. This is yeah. You know, that's the last slide. So you can, I guess you can just see it right now, and then we can conclude.
Yeah, I'm sure if time permits, we could take some of these questions. I mean, some of these questions in our Q&A session.
Absolutely. Yeah. These are the recommendations. And just to conclude, based on some of the findings that Anhad explained, the main recommendation here, which does rope in everything else, is that there is a deep need for the homeless to be acknowledged as migrants, as working migrants, and not merely users of shelters. So with that, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ashwin and Anhad. With this, let's move on to our final presentation. So we are moving from Yamuna front to Shillong now. Over to you, Jagrati.
the presentation visible?
Yes, Jagrati, please go on. It's visible.
Yes, good morning, everyone. So I'm Jagrati, and this study was part of my urban design thesis. Um, the topic that I'm exploring is synergizing shared spaces in a divided city. Now, what do I mean by this urban divide? Generally, the divide can be a lot of types, but the one that I'm focusing on here is the one centered around sovereignty, identity, and territorialization. So, the spatial expression of this urban divide generally manifests itself in the form of a fragmented urban landscape where we see enclaves of homogeneity being formed in the city. There is very limited interactions between the different contrasting backgrounds of people. There is a defensive built environment that can be perceived in the space, and there is certain negative memory of spaces. Now, why I believe that this topic right now is an important study to be taken up is because currently our city spaces, they are becoming more and more polarized, and there is a lot of undemocratic city spaces that we can witness. The intolerance towards difference is on the rise, and because privatization is kind of taking up on our cities, so the exposure to a varied kind of cultural background is minimizing. So this study, the main aim of this study was to inquire the role of urban design in creating these shared spaces and kind of bridging this social divide or urban divide that we have. My particular thesis or my particular study, it focused on Northeast India because there we see a lot of friction that comes in between the locals, the tribals of the area, and the migrants. Particularly, I've studied Shillong, which is also my hometown. Why I took up Shillong, there are four reasons for it. Because the history itself has a divide. There's a, Shillong was initially the headquarters, the British headquarters. It was a tribal land, but then there's so much of migration that has happened in the past 100 years. We have the migrants that form 50% of the population of Shillong who have been living here for over 100 years, and yet they are looked upon as the outsiders. Now, this is the basic context, or this is the historical divide. But over time, this started manifesting itself as, with the city spaces becoming fragmented. And also, right now, I believe that this is a good time when we have become aware of this divide, and, people would be more willing to recognize it. So that is where urban design comes into the picture, and we need to now introduce certain shared spaces in the city so that people can experience multiplicity. And there is this concept by Doreen Massey about thrown togetherness. And I believe urban design can be the way ahead for that. So just to give a brief idea about Shillong. So okay, it's popular. It's popular as the rock capital of India. It's a tourism hotspot. It's also an educational hub. There's a lot of sports enthusiasts from this side. The local tribes are called the Khasis, which follow Christianity. It's a matrilineal society. And yes, so if we look at the structure of the city, the city has basically grown along the central movement corridor. And if we look at this figure ground, we can see that the central movement corridor kind of divides itself into two kinds of urban fabric. The one towards the south, this is much more sparse with larger footprints because this is majorly occupied by the government buildings, which in the map below you can see, which has been marked in blue. And the other part of the movement corridor, it is surrounded by smaller footprints, much more dense, because this is the commercial setup of the city. And towards the periphery, we have all kinds of residential clusters. Now, what I was saying when I said that it has a fragmented landscape, so this is like, just to quickly explain, this is a mapping that I had done of the city, where I tried to map the different neighborhoods. So we observe that there is a pattern that whenever a different set of people who migrated to the city, they kind of formed their own clusters, and it has been so over the time. There is very few mixed neighborhoods in the city, in fact almost nil, where you can actually find people from contrasting backgrounds living together. Now what happens is, when you have a city that is so starked out, or so that is so well defined in its neighborhood, uh, it's very easy to target certain neighborhoods, and that is what we see in Shillong. That whenever any sort of ethnic conflicts, or whenever any sort of protest happens, it's very easy to find a pattern of which neighborhoods will get targeted, which neighborhoods are generally the epicenter of such divides. So Another thing that we can we can observe through this map is that if we see the neighborhoods are towards the we can say the outer circle of the city, and the central city, which is actually devoid or of any sort of claim, it is completely occupied by government buildings. So the one space where actually there is no territorialization as such actually does not have anything to offer to the city, because it is occupied by a lot of government buildings. So my study, this apart from inquiring the role of urban design, so the approach was to find a framework that could quantify the inclusivity in such a divided city. That was the approach that I took. So the first part of the approach was to understand the scope, or to identify the places which had a scope of encounter. Just to go back to the slide, because a lot of theory suggests that uh, once we witness people from the other side, so to say, reacting to this environment the same way as we do, we kind of induce tolerance towards them. So the entire concept of conviviality, so the first part of my study was to map the movement pattern of the so-called tribals and the migrants, based on three kinds of movements: necessary movement based on living and convenience shopping, the second was for work and education, and the third was optional movement for recreational and lifestyle shopping. So if you look at the map, the one in blue, the dotted lines indicate pedestrian movement, and the through lines indicate vehicular movements. The blue indicates the movement for the tribals, and the orange indicates the movement for the non-tribals. So in terms of necessary movement, we can see that because obviously the neighborhoods are separated, so there is very little overlap that happens in that case, except for this one traditional old market that we have, that's called Uda, where both parties, people from both the parties, they kind of come together to buy vegetables, fruits, and other kinds of stuff. During work and education, I observed that the spots that become a kind of convivial place is the taxi stands and the junctions, where people generally come to wait for their buses and their taxis. Um, and the third, like for optional movement, I observed that it was places like Police Bazaar, and somewhat towards the edge of MG Road, where a lot of shops, cafes, and restaurants, third places, the a lot of third places are available. They offered a lot of scope for encounters to happen. So once I had identified these five spots where there I received footfall from a varied background, the second step of my study was to analyze the built environment of these identified spots, which I did on the basis of 7 to 8 parameters, which I derived from my theoretical studies, which was basically proximity or density of the space, permeability, physical accessibility, visual accessibility, what kind of open space structure do they have, what is the building projection, how are the building projections, is it enhancing the divide, or is it actually helping you to form certain kind of connections with the outside. Then the diversity that that particular precinct offered, and the presence of the third places. So likewise, I started, I studied each of the precinct in depth. This is just a little bit of, like, for example, in MG Road, when I um, when I went about through the corridor, although it's the major movement corridor in the city, I observed that there is nothing much that it can offer, because we have these government buildings which have these dead facades and high compound walls, so that creates a visual barrier in terms of interaction. The sidewalks were too narrow for people to stop and interact, if at all. And in contrast to that was Police Point, which is where which is where this which is where the MG Road basically culminates. And this is a major node in the city, so it has a lot of diverse activities into it. There's a lot of footfall. Um Similarly, if we look at another precinct, which was Police Bazaar, here, because this was a mixed use kind of a setup, there was, there also we had all these buildings with balconies, so that provided kind of a visual connect. And then we had the vendors, which created a further layer of, which kind of invited people to stop for a moment and interact into certain kind of activities. And again, in contrast to that was another neighborhood that I studied, which was Mokhar, which was purely a residential neighborhood. So here again, we saw that there was a lot of exclusivity in its setup. We had these compounded walls. There was a lot of a territorialization with high compound walls and inward looking built environment, so to say. Now, once I studied the built environment of these different precincts, the second or the next step was to identify certain shared interests which could be introduced in these areas that could create a collective culture, or that could create a collective identity which was much beyond ethnicity. So, based on a few questionnaires that I had circulated and a lot of interviews that I had taken, in context to Shillong, there were some 7 to 8 parameters that I found which could act as a shared interest activity. That was food, music, cafes. There's a very strong cafe culture that is there in Shillong. Art and craft, festivals, leisure, and so on. So this is one of the layers. For example, when I started mapping these layers, so what I did was, within my precinct, suppose if food and music is the layer that I'm mapping, I mapped them with respect to the with a radius of around 3 by 3, and mapped their inclusivity. Like if it's a cafe, then how inclusive, or what is the kind of who is having the claim over it. So in that way, I went about doing the mapping, and the general observations that I could see was, although food and music was a layer that kind of invited a lot of people, but currently that layer remains indoors, and there's not a lot of manifestation of it in the outdoors. Similarly, street gigs or music. So because most of this musical gigs happen in the indoors, we do not have any spots in the city where we can have outdoor gigs which can invite a lot of people into it. Similarly, if we look at the trend or at the way the festivals happen, again because the neighborhood itself is divided, so you do not get a lot of opportunity to witness each other's festivals, which means you don't get a lot of interaction or a lot of learning out of each other's culture, which ultimately does not make you very tolerant towards the other. So yeah, and then similarly, I mean, another aspect of it was the feature of walking. Now, people in Shillong are very pro walking. Like almost 79% of them, they prefer walking over other modes of transport. But this corridor, the MG Road, was the one that is preferred. That is the preferred walking corridor. But I mapped the pace of people walking throughout this area. We saw that the pace of people walking through that was comparatively pretty fast. That is because this entire stretch does not really offer a lot of activities to the people. And when you're walking, when you're walking that fast, or when you're not actually slowing down to become aware of the kind of people that you are surrounded by, it does not really help you in terms of conviviality, in terms of focused interactions and things like that. And in contrast to that, in the study itself, this white patch that we saw here, people actually slowed down a lot. So when we actually blow that up and try and understand the reason for them slowing down, is one of the biggest reasons was obviously the sidewalk ballet that happens there. And however, here, because there is absence of any kind of urban design interventions, like street furniture, a certain kind of an open space where people could actually sit and witness the entire day unfolding or things like that. So a lot of people just tend to walk through again, although it's slow walking, but they tend to walk through and not really stop and observe. So after all of this study was done, like all this different kinds of, after analyzing the precinct and different kinds of inclusivity, I ultimately quantified that into this map. I mean, ultimately generated this map with the blue patches showing the most inclusive, and the light red showing the least inclusive of spaces. So, it could be observed that the central city remained mostly non-inclusive, and we had two patches of inclusive spaces in the city, which was majorly because of the presence of commercial centers in that area. So my entire, like after that, when I went to the proposal stage, this map actually gave me a very logical and very clear explanation of what I had to do. So my approach was that I had to link up these two individual or segregated patches of blue and create certain more blue patches, linking these two bigger patches of blue. So that formed the entire basis of my structure plan. So I started off by providing these two bigger urban parks at the at the two nodes of the city, which got connected by these smaller activity pockets that I introduced. And then I worked obviously on the connections of them, working on the sidewalk design and working on how these different activity pockets would get connected, so that ultimately I increase the kind of blues in my entire area. And together it can just form it can form a much more inclusive environment for people to engage in. So yeah, I'll just yeah actually yeah. So these were some of the interventions that I had proposed. For example, the one of it was the urban park. So I was talking about how people here tend to walk slow, but because there is no open space as such. And another point that I made was about not having a place where multiple festivals can be celebrated. So this location of this urban park is such that it does not the location is such that no one community can have a claim on that land. So it's a very what do you say, the same space can be claimed by different communities in different times of the year based on whatever festivals are coming. So it makes it much more approachable. That was the entire idea, and it is a place where people could simply come by and engage into different kind of activities. The second intervention that I had made was because, while studying the city, I realized that the last sort of public space that was made in the city was back, in 1870s. So that's a long time. That was during the British time. And so the city needed a more contemporary open space. And because it's Shillong, it's a very picturesque landscape, and nature is something that people generally bond upon. I thought, why not provide this sort of big patch of urban park within the city, where we have the cultural center at one corner of it, and the rest of the space can be utilized for certain city level functions. But more importantly, you have this as a vantage point from where you can kind of enjoy and take in the entire landscape of the city. So that was the entire point. And then the smaller activity
Sorry
pockets.
to interrupt you, Jagriti. Could you please conclude in 1 minute? Because
Yes, ma'am. I'm almost done. Yes. So the smaller activity pockets that I introduced, one was it's a promenade and an outdoor library. Then we have these graffiti walls that could be, where the frontages of the government building, the underutilized frontages of the government building, they could be converted into these graffiti walls so that people could have certain niche interactions based on their shared interest. Then there's this concept of repair cafes and chado stalls. Like these are very particular to Shillong itself. And then we could have these shared gardens. So yes, so basically to conclude, the entire idea of the study was to kind of quantify or to kind of come up with some certain kind of approach to firstly acknowledge the divide in the city, to understand how we can recognize the divide, and then go ahead quantifying the entire process, so that that can lead us to where and what kind of spaces that the city needs, which can encourage interactions, positive stories about the city. And ultimately we can kind of reduce the divide, the urban divide in the city. Yes, thank you.
thanks for all your such engaging papers. We have, I think, 5 minutes more for the question answer session, and I could see that a very kind of an organic flow between all these among all these papers. So where the very first presentation, in fact, rightfully sort of provided the theoretical relevance, and then the while explaining the experiences of migrant workers in the urban imaginary, and then the policy frame requires for this, through there this sort of a framework for, I find it is quite fascinating, that is this sedentary bias. So the rest of the presentations then help us to go this framework actually help us to go beyond this dichotomies of rootedness and uprootedness through multi-layered and I would say, cited possibilities. So in this context, I could see that there is quite a lot of scope for the conversation between the first presentation and the presentations we heard from the Yamuna front, and in fact, sort of a policy option or a policy framework from Anil Kumar's and Pragya's presentation and so on. So before taking up few questions, do you want to interact with each other on these lines? Perhaps the very first presentation, and then Ashwin's and Anhad's presentation, and then and how do Anil Kumar and Pragya want to respond to these some of these sedentary bias aspects and so on. Perhaps we can take 1 minute for that.
Sure.
You want to go first, Anhad and Ashwin?
Sure. Yeah, I think there, just as you said, there is a lot of crossover in in terms, I think, of trying to understand how best to adequately identify and frame settlements and populations that are not necessarily recognized. And I think that if I look at all of our papers together, one of the themes seems to be trying to understand the dimensions of each of the populations that we're working with, and trying to understand specific sites of the relationship between people, and not only cities in general, but specific sites in the city. The slum survey showed that quite well. The comparison between certain sites that have land tenure and not land tenure grades therein, in some way, tells us something about the capabilities and tells us something about access to the city itself. I mean, just from our perspective, or for the population that we work with, it is not zero sum in terms of being completely off the grid. Does not necessarily mean that one is completely without. And I think that comes from the demand side part of the equation, which is that there are people who are excluded from inherently from policy and the position of that the city takes on people who don't have a place, but they still manage to survive. They still manage to get access. And I think all of us have, in some ways, an appreciation for maybe not having the answers completely, but looking at where we can identify those mechanisms, those people, and those places in the city. That's what I got from listening to many of the papers.
Thanks.
Yes. Can I, Neethi? Yeah, just got a little provoked by Ashwin's. Yes, it's excellent. These three papers are together putting up a different kind of, imaginary in the cities. And I would point out Anhad's, the work profile that they are getting into, all its seasonality still continues there, marriage and other things dominated by that main livelihood scenario. But once you look at our paper, the regularity of jobs, improves because of the tenure and security of tenure, whatever, partial or completely, that is given. So the assurance that happens even for 10 years or 20 years leasehold and other things, making an impact that is visible in the society, in human capital, in diversification of, livings in that particular sense. So I think, and the major context of, we have been now at least been convincing being an urban planner or regional planner or the urban designer, that, you know, in situ development for shelter is a must. I mean, that's what we have to propose, and we have to fight for Delhi master plan, which is, you know, NIU is doing. So I think no displacement, zero displacement, that's what been the policy framework. And this establishes, these case studies establishes that fact. Maybe it is a case study, I can't guarantee that it is wholesome everywhere it is happening, but I think these are the pointers so that, you know, you give little feedback to the policy and convincing ourselves to improve the, you know, or mainstream this section of the society. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Anil Kumar. All these conversations, as we know very well, you know, we can't just stop here. We're just trying to sort of starting, or this is only the beginning of our conversations. And I'm sure you'll be able to keep in touch with each other so that you could continue such conversations, such meaningful conversations. So I'll just move on to Maansi. Got a question to Ennarpura presentation. Do you want to just have a look at it, or I can just read this out to Priyadarshini and Sona? So Maansi is asking, thanks for giving us a spatial history and morphology of Ennarpura. In your research, did you encounter any schisms between returnees and residents of the town in the aftermath of lockdown? How did the latter actually perceive the changes brought about by the return migration? Would you like to respond?
Yeah. The returnees were they are the people from Ennarpura who had earlier migrated from Ennarpura. So when they returned back, they were either the skilled laborers or unskilled laborers. So it was definitely a plus point for the little town. We got much more workers, laborers on our estate. So it was a positive outcome.
Thanks, Sona. Thanks. So there are a couple of questions to Jagriti. Can you see these questions, Jagriti? Do you want to respond to these questions?
Yes, ma'am. I can see one from Facebook. It asks me whether did you find any elements which can improve interactions and economic mutual dependency, which will be bridging the tribal and migration. Yes. So, okay. So when we study the context of Shillong, as I told that it's an upcoming tourist hub itself. So tourism is one layer in which, which kind of involves people from both the tribals as well as the migrants in some way or the other. Another thing which can bridge the divide. So there was the sidewalk ballet that I was talking about. So while doing the study, I realized that there are certain items, or there are certain features which are only certain items that are solely sold by the tribal sellers, and there are certain items which is only brought to the city by the migrants. So once we start placing, in a public space, once we start placing both these kind of street vendors and these people, so in a way that will help to increase the mix of that particular place, and it can help to create the kind of interactions we want to happen. Yes, that's.
There is one more question for you from Maansi. Just
in the case of other, is commercial use preferred over green spaces by the city administration while planning common spaces? Yes, unfortunately, totally true. The second proposal that I had given about that huge chunk of green space, so that's actually a land, it was a government land, there was PWD quarters there, which is now up for redevelopment. So there was a huge hue and cry here because the government wanted to come up with a shopping mall there. And a lot of us, we were protesting against it because it's right in the center of the city, and although there is so much green in the city, there is no public space in the city, open public space where people can use it as a public space. So ultimately now that chunk of land, it's still under controversies, but yes, unfortunately, I mean the political, I mean the administration does not kind of give preference to green spaces over commercial spaces. Yes, that's the problem.
Thanks, Jagriti. There is another question to Ashwin and Anhad. Could you read that in the Q&A chat box? Or I can read this out. Question to Ashwin and Anhad: to recount any cases where anyone of the respondents were able to beat the circumstances, and what helped such a person or persons?
Anhad, do you want me to go first, or do you want to?
You go ahead. Yeah, I have one in mind, but I want to hear you. Yeah.
So that was not the focus of this particular paper, but both of us both together and respectively have focused on that question, and the short answer is yes. And the means by which some, and it is a very small minority of people who are able to quote unquote exit homelessness through the help of social organizations, NGOs. And by the way, the NGOs are the main sort of governance hub of homelessness in Delhi, because they manage all the shelters. But apart from managing the shelters, many, or in particularly those that have had a long history with working with homeless people, have instituted programs of employment and also liaisoning between them and the government and for legal aid, and so, and also drug de-addiction programs. So there are in some certain cases successes in enabling, facilitating people's journey back home, meaning with their either nuclear joint families, oftentimes in other parts of India, Bihar, Jharkhand, UP, West Bengal, but in a also in a minority of cases, getting jobs in the city, security guard jobs, or even some that require some kind of training and some of the skills that Anhad had showed in our presentation. Anhad, you want to say something?
Yes, I want to add, just to reiterate what Ashwin was saying, that was of course not the focus of the paper, but having said that, there were a couple of people who NGOs themselves sort of over time employed because of their familiarity with the place. Ducible in the money allotted to the shelters by the Delhi Urban Shelter Improvement Board, there are salaries budgeted for cleaners and caretakers. So there were instances where the population at the certain people at the Pushta themselves, because of their familiarity and with the NGO and with the problem, were absorbed into the shelter staff itself. But those are very exceptional cases. You don't find those kind of people at the Pushta at all.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ashwin and Anhad. So with this, we have to close this session. Once again, let me thank all panelists for being part of this year's Urban Arc, and looking forward to meeting you all next year for our next round. Okay, all the best. Thanks.